But I can tell you that most of the Christians who I knew who were detectives really did not embrace an investigative approach to their Christian worldview. So they believed these things, but if you asked them, well, why do you believe these things, they would typically not be able to give you any satisfying, especially for guys who are raised up in an investigative environment, right? I mean, we're making cases all the time. I was always kind of shocked that my Christian friends who were police officers wouldn't take the same approach in looking at these big metaphysical claims, the most important claims of all, and they just didn't. And so that, for a long time, that kind of put me off. I was not compelled to even start thinking about Christianity if it required me to turn off my brain and not examine the finer details, not put a heavy emphasis on the evidence, because I'm such an evidentialist as a professional. So that was important to me.
You moved, I love this, I love this. You say you moved from belief that this was real to believing in.
Yeah, and
that's
a tough distinction sometimes, but I think it's an important one. And for me, the difference was that as I investigated who Jesus was through the eyewitness claims of the gospel authors, I did come to a place where I felt this was reliable eyewitness testimony. We have to deal with it. Something miraculous clearly happened in the first century that led these authors to make the claims they did. They seemed to be able to substantiate these claims in the same way I would test any eyewitness. I felt like I could test these eyewitnesses. And that did lead me to a place where I had belief that the documents were reliable and that Jesus was who they said he was. But I still didn't have belief in. As I've thought about it over the years, I think the best way to explain it is the more I investigated who Jesus was in the Gospels, that brought me to believe that. But when I investigated what the Gospels said about me and my need for a Savior, that moved me from belief that to trust in. And that's a different move altogether. But I don't think, I never could have stepped in without going through the that. So that process of going from really understanding, is there good reason to believe this is true, to trusting in it was really important for me in my journey.
Now, I'm guessing that you are a changed man as a result, and
I hope so.
You're still doing the same job somehow along with all these other things. What do your peers think of the new Jim Wallis?
Well, I took some abuse for a while, and even, for many years, actually, from people who knew me before. But as those guys retired, there were less and less of them in my work life to kind of point out to the others. I knew Jim before he preached all this stuff. So now, as I accept a new role with my agency as a chaplain, I'm still at crime scenes, but when you go as a chaplain, you go in a different capacity than you used to go as an investigator. So I still love to be able to work with investigators, but I think now that they understand who I am and they accept me in that role. I hope. We'll see.
Okay, now you're the expert and I'm the student. We are the students. So I'm not sure where to start, but I'm wondering if this template for courtroom exam is a good place to start our investigation.
Yeah, and I think there's a template that we typically use with eyewitnesses in courtrooms that does serve our purposes here. And what we ask are 4 simple things. Really, we have 14 questions in a jury setting, but there are 4 things they all boil down to. And they are, look, do we think the person was really even there to begin with? And can they be corroborated in some way? Do we have another witness talking about this or some other evidence at the scene? And third, do we have any sense that they've changed their story over time? Have they been accurate and honest repeatedly, or are they kind of shifty on their story? And the final thing is, do they have some bias that would cause them to lie to us because they're trying to protect a family member, or they're just have a certain prejudice toward our suspect or against our suspect? So we have to really kind of look at those 4 issues.
So you applied all of this to the case for the resurrection of
Yeah,
Jesus
I basically
Christ.
looked and said, hey, we've got eyewitnesses who said this happened. If we measured them in these 4 ways, would they survive that kind of measurement, that kind of examination? And how well would they survive it? And as I went through this process of just looking at those 4 areas, you have to deal with the fact that these witnesses do qualify. They do pass the litmus test, especially considering the antiquity of their testimony. I can't imagine another ancient testimony passing the test the way these gospel authors do. And a lot of that's because it's been revered, and the testimony has been revered over time. It's been preserved carefully. It's been transmitted to us over time. And it's been considered important testimony by thousands. So it's been protected in that way. So it's been delivered to us in a way we can look at it and say, okay, I want to examine it and see for myself. Do I have any good reason to reject it, first of all? And if not, why am I not? What am I going to do with it? I mean, if Jesus really rose from the dead, what am I going to do with that? I got to do something with it. So I think that's the biggest question that God has for us is, what are you going to do with Jesus?
The big interesting difference between this investigation of the resurrection and what you outline as your modus operandi in Alive, this marvelous little book, kind of a reduction of the big book, is that there's no dead guy. Like,
Yeah.
can you see the little visual in here? We're doing, what do you call it when you go to the?
Well, you go to death scenes all the time, right? But not every death scene is a murder scene, and I only have to work the murder scene. So the first thing we have to do when we get in the room is decide what kind of scene is this? Is this a natural, an accidental, a suicide, or a homicide?
Right.
The first three, you're looking at evidence in the room to make a decision about whether it's one of these four. Which four is the most reasonable inference given the evidence in the room? Well, that process we call abductive reasoning, I think works for us as we look at the evidence in the first century of the empty tomb, of the crucifixion and death of Jesus, of the transformation of eyewitnesses who claimed, at least, to have seen a risen Christ. I think if you wanted to end this in the first season, in the first generation of witnesses, you could have done it one of two ways. Get the body of Jesus, let's show everybody he's not risen again. So the empty tomb, I think, is in some ways rather uncontroversial. The second way I think you could do it is to drag those eyewitnesses out and have them recant their testimony. And we don't have any of that in the first century either. So I think we have just 3 or 4 bare minimal pieces of evidence in the room. Well, then I said, okay, well, in any death scene, you have 4 possibilities, those 4 I listed. Well, in this scene, there are a number of possible ways to explain those 4 pieces of evidence: the death and crucifixion crucifixion and death of Jesus, the empty tomb, transformation of witnesses. Those are the bare minimals. Then how do I explain those? As an atheist, I would have offered a number of alternative explanations. I would have said,
and they're in here.
yeah, they're lying.
Oh, yep.
They were confused.
They stole the body.
They had delusions. They had fooled by an imposter. He didn't really die on the cross. There are a number of ways to explain those 4 or 5 minimal pieces of evidence. And of course, one of the explanations is the Christian one. He actually just rose from the dead. Yeah. So I would look at all of those explanations the same way I do in a death scene and ask myself which best fits and explains the evidence in the room. Now, every explanation has a liability. And every set of explanation, every case I've ever worked that we won and a jury decided in 3 hours he was guilty, even in those, there were liabilities on our case. The jurors
That's not reasonable doubt.
No,
It's
those are
different.
possible doubts.
Okay.
Different than reasonable doubts. And so all of us have possible doubts. And even there are some times when you have like 10 things that point to a same conclusion, and there's one outlying thing. And that's your case's liability. And you have to hope that people are able to see that these 10 things really cannot be thought of any other way, and the outlier is just, we're never going to have an answer for that.
So you outweigh the pros.
Right. The pros
Outweigh
and cons of every case.
con.
And every case has got pros and cons. So I would have said, now as I looked through those in this booklet, all the alternative explanations that are offered by me as an atheist 17 years ago, they all have numerous really critical liabilities that really don't get the job done. But the Christian explanation also has a liability. And the liability from our perspective as Christians is that we are offering a supernatural explanation. And if you're a philosophical naturalist, somebody who rejects the existence of a supernatural God, well, that's a liability you're not willing to cross. That's a liability that's a deal killer for you.
Now,
and
you
it
make
was
it
for me,
clear,
too.
if we're going to be detectives, if we're really going to take on the case, we have to lay down our presuppositions.
That's right.
Including there is no supernatural.
That's right. So if we're saying, hey, I'm out today to investigate whether or not something supernatural occurred, the resurrection, I cannot begin by saying, well, but keep in mind, nothing supernatural ever occurs. If you do that, you've already kind of got your conclusion in hand before you go anywhere. And as a detective, that's happened to me before, where I thought I had a certain kind of crime scene, and I made that choice up front and wasted a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks chasing a suspect who didn't exist because I was so determined to make this crime scene fit in my presupposition. So I would say here, if we're going to be honest and fair in examining the resurrection, we cannot begin with a presupposition against supernaturalism. And if you don't do that, it turns out that our explanation is by far the most reasonable and has the least number of liabilities.
Wow. Aren't you glad he's going to be back tomorrow? I just scratched the surface. Yeah, your son in his 20s, he's a cop.
Yes.
You are 3 generations of
Yeah.
policemen.
I have 2 sons, 2 daughters, and I have one who's in med school, and I have one who's a police officer, has my name. So yeah, we have 3 generations of guys with the same name. I always say we're like the George Foreman of law enforcement. You know, we have the same name over and over and over again.
Oh, yeah,
And
George. We know him.
So we're kind of the same way. My dad has the same name as my son, and we've been there for 52 years. And for the next 30, my son will carry on that. And I think he feels pressure now to have a son named Jim that will become a police officer. So we have the 4th generation. But for now, yeah, 3 of us have done the job. And that doesn't mean that all of us are Christians.
I was going to ask.
It isn't the case. So a lot of it is presuppositions. What do I hold in my hand and refuse to let go of before I begin? That's a big question for all of us who are watching this today. If you're on the skeptical fence, what are you holding in your hand that prevents you from looking at the evidence?
You've unpacked this just like the case you actually did.
I tried to. I think if you do take that approach, you'll have great confidence in your conclusions. And that's our hope here, right? Is that people will look at this, and like Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, if this isn't true, the resurrection, we're to be pitied. It's all a sham. We've been lying to you. You've followed a lie. It's all for nothing. So it's worth our time, I think, to investigate to make sure that it isn't a lie, that it actually is true. And that was what I hope to do there.